Chapter 10. Dre. Old Rivals. So you're telling me that this boy, Captain Rucker, an unkempt but finely dressed man with dark hair that reached well past his ears, who appeared to be in his late 30s, gestured in Dre's vicinity without looking at him, is offering to come along and carry a bunch of our stuff for free? Captain Rucker asked, his square face filled with an expression morphing between amusement, confusion, and annoyance. Dre was close enough to be considered part of the conversation, but he was far too intimidated to join in. He watched and listened as Adian and the captain discussed him as if he wasn't there. The three of them stood in a clearing in front of the mayor's mansion, surrounded by a ragged group of dull tents. Yes, he recently gained the Pac-Man class, and he wants to test his new capabilities, Adian replied. The captain shrugged. I've never heard of that class, but if you relieve some of the burden from my men, then I see no reason to object, although you'll need to make sure that he is aware that I make no promises for his safety, and that I do not consider him a member of the militia. As such, he will receive no pay for active duty, nor will his family be paid a death pension if he falls. He said all this directly to Adian, without even glancing in Dre's direction. Being so blatantly ignored made Dre feel small, but compared to this captain, he was small, wasn't he? Adian either didn't notice that the captain was not deeming to acknowledge Dre, or he just didn't care. He responded, his voice raised in challenge. Why would he fall? This is just a scouting mission, isn't it? Of course. But we both know that one can never be sure what will happen on any mission, especially one like this, with so many unknowns. Sometimes men die, and there's nothing anyone can do about it. The captain sneered at Adian. Wouldn't you agree, Bard? Dre looked back and forth between the field musician and the captain. Adian hadn't mentioned any specifics about his relationship with the man, but as Dre stood there watching them argue, it was impossible to miss the nearly palpable animosity. Both men were breathing more heavily, talking more loudly, and standing more imposingly than was polite or necessary. Dre might have found it humorous if he wasn't quite so close. You are well aware that my class is field musician, and we both know that if you would have listened to me back then, that Greymar, Lauden, Ferdisha, Nurpole, and Elmbim would still all be alive. If I had listened to you, then we would all be dead. Don't pretend that foolhardy plan to rescue them would have actually worked. If you had listened to me in the first place and not taken that creator-forsaken contract, then we would have never placed ourselves into such a terrible situation. Save your breath, Bard. I don't have time to waste on your bloated morality. Send the boy to me if he really wants to come along. I have some things that he could carry. Don't bother joining him. I don't want to have to see your face until we depart. As their dialogue had progressed, the two of them had drawn closer, like bulls drawn towards red, until they were face to face, only a hair's breadth apart. Dre was sure that they would come to blows, but after a long, strained moment of silence, Adian turned away from the man. He approached Dre with an expression torn between fury and disgust, as he used the corner of his sleeve to wipe away some of the captain's spittle that still managed to cling to his face. When he was right in front of Dre, he looked down at the now damp sleeve in apparent revulsion. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. After long moments, he looked up at Dre and said, As you might have heard, Captain Rucker, that classless He cut off what he would have been the first true profanity that Dre had heard from the man, and took another deep breath. The captain would like you to meet him in his tent, so that he can give you things to carry. Knowing him, I would guess that they will be unnecessary and heavy. Adian's gaze intensified. It isn't too late to back out. Seeing him again is making me question bringing you along. With him in charge, anyone on this mission is in danger. Dre tried to keep the burning curiosity out of his tone as he replied, So the two of you have a contentious history then? Adian stared at Dre blankly for a few moments before realization dawned in his expression. I did mention that I used to be part of the Raven militia, didn't I? Dre nodded his head, and Adian grunted in acknowledgement before he continued. These men all belonged to a specialized unit within the militia, based out of Raven. Until a few months ago, so did I. I was a standard member for over 2 years before I was promoted to squad leader. Everything was going well, until Rucker, another squad leader, received a class evolution, and was promoted to be my direct superior. After that, my life became miserable. The only thing that clashed more than our personalities was our moral standards. Even still, I stayed partly out of desire to protect my men from his lunacy, partly out of fear of the unknown. Until Rucker made a mistake. It was a horrible decision that I tried desperately to talk him out of, but it was to no avail. It ended up costing 5 good people their lives, and gained nothing but a few measly coins. I quit the next morning. By the end of the explanation, Dre had started to sweat. If this Captain Rucker was really as bad as that, then maybe he shouldn't join this mission. But when else would he get an opportunity to prove himself? Before his mind came up with a satisfactory answer, a question intruded into his thoughts. If you are so against him, why are you helping him? You're no longer a member of the militia, no longer forced to be under his control. So why are you choosing to put yourself under his command? Adian opened his mouth to speak, but then closed it. He was silent for long moments as he pondered his next words carefully. People need to be protected, especially those who can't protect themselves. He paused again for even longer, but when he finally spoke, his words were stronger, more full of conviction than before. I am a creationist. I believe that since I have the ability to protect people, I have a moral obligation to do so. Adian turned his gaze upward and glared at the sky. It just so happens that this time, protecting people means willingly submitting myself to the suffering that is an inevitable side effect of being in Rucker's presence. Dre wasn't sure if that last line was directed at him or not. He studied Adian's face, searched for any sign of deception or exaggeration, but all Dre saw was sincerity. He felt something stir within himself. He pulled back his shoulders, straightened his back, and his chest as his resolution firmed. He spoke in a confident tone that surprised even him. If you have a moral obligation to help, then so do I. Adian locked eyes with Dre, but he didn't respond immediately. It seemed like he wanted to refute the words, but instead he nodded seriously and said, You are a grown man who has passed his class day. You can make your own choices, but it would be foolish to not at least acknowledge the risk and your own inexperience. I may not be experienced in combat, but I am experienced at carrying stuff. And even with Captain Rucker in command, that is more than likely still all that I will be doing, right? Adian nodded slowly, but he didn't look all that convinced. I'm a little nervous about it now, but I was the one to invite you in the first place, and I won't rescind that invitation. Since you are joining, you'd better pick up the gear from Rucker. As you could probably guess, he is in the big one. Adian pointed to a tent that was at least twice as large and twice as nice as any of the others. But before you do, are you sure that my instruments are safe? I know you said that everything placed in the pack is somehow kept separate from each other, but will that change when you load more stuff into it? The last thing I need is all my instruments getting smashed by a pile of Rucker's useless supplies. They are made extra tough and resilient by my skill, but they aren't indestructible. They quite easily still go out of tune, which can drastically reduce the potency of my songs. Dre stopped himself from rolling his eyes and replied with a mostly neutral tone. As I have assured you before, everything that goes in the pack is completely safe. A lot safer than carrying them around in a rickety cart on an uneven road, at least. I don't know exactly what is happening, but it's like each of them gets its own space. When I reach into the bag to get something out, all I have to do is focus on it, and then it will appear at the bottom of the bag, alone and in perfect condition. Like I said, I don't really know how, but these items are all in my bag, but they aren't really together in there, if that makes sense. Adian scrunched up his eyes, brought his right hand up to massage his temples, and looked pleadingly up into the sky. No, Dre, that doesn't make any sense. When you put things in a bag, all the other things are also in that bag, and the items touch each other, even if the bag is somehow magically expanded. I have seen and used a bag of holding before. Items don't just magically disappear inside of them. Dre let out a frustrated huff from his nose. Well, have you ever used a Pac-Man's pack? Because my pack obviously doesn't work like all the other bags of holding. Adian released a long, suffering sigh that sounded eerily similar to something Dre had heard from his mother at least 1,000 times, before Adian said, Just let me see. Dre let out a sigh of his own, but reluctantly took off his pack, opened the top, and stared into it for a couple heartbeats. He kept his head still, but lifted his eyes to glare up at Adian. Then he reached in and removed a small instrument made of delicate, pale wood. He handed it to Adian. Is it broken? He asked, sarcastically. Because if it was put into a normal bag with a bunch of other heavy stuff, it assuredly would be. You put my piccolo in the main pack and not by itself in one of the side pockets? Adian questioned, his mouth agape. He took a couple steps until he was right next to the pack, looked into it, and started to reach inside. but his hand stopped at the mouth of the bag. Was he pretending he couldn't reach inside for some reason? After a few moments of what Dre had assumed was some sort of charade, Adian began grunting quietly in a way that made Dre question whether this was really the kind of man that he wanted to throw his lot in with. "What you doing?" Dre asked in a light, calming tone that he usually reserved for pets and small children. Adian looked up from the bag and glared at Dre. "What do you think I'm doing? I'm trying to get my stuff out of your ludicrous pack. How do you get inside this stupid thing?" Dre reached down into the bag and pulled out a small rectangular instrument. "My harmonica!" Adian exclaimed as he snatched it from Dre. "How did you do that?" He again tried to reach in the bag, but again he didn't manage to get past the opening at the top. This time Dre looked more closely and noticed that muscles and tendons were bulging from Adian's forearms and the edges of his hand, and splayed fingers were white, as if he was pressing hard against some sort of invisible barrier. Dre's brow furrowed as he watched Adian futilely attempt to get inside the bag, and then he was struck with a realization. "Oh," he said aloud, and then slowly nodded to himself as the ramifications of what he had just realized poured into his mind. Adian looked up and his face began to turn red. "Oh? What? You can't just think of something like that and then not share it." "Oh?" Dre said this time, giving the end of it a questioning lilt. Adian's face grew redder, and it looked like his eyes were attempting to bulge out of his head. Okay, Dre relented. "I don't know for sure, as I'm still figuring all this out, but it looks like I might be the only one who can access the stuff in my pack." Adian froze. "So you're telling me that I put all of my most valued possession in a place where I can't access them? What's to stop you from just stealing everything? You have to warn people about this before letting them put their entire lives in your bottomless pack." "Well, I didn't know," Dre replied, accentuating the I and the no. "And I am not going to steal your stuff. I am trying to help you. To get in your good graces, remember?" Dre could feel the frustration building in him, similar in nature, if not in scale, to when he had lashed out at Asya the day before. He stood there, mind racing, awaiting Adian's next verbal joust. But after a few moments, when no such response came, he began to actually see what Adian was doing. The man was almost completely still. His eyes were closed and he was taking deep, slow breaths. His face raised to the sky. Dre's confusion pushed his anger to the side. Was the conversation over? Should he say something? Had Adian fallen asleep or something? Dre wanted to say something, but instead he started to slow his own breathing. He closed his eyes and he felt the heat from his face receding as the fog of anger cleared from his mind. Why was Adian being so aggressive and accusing him? Dre hadn't done anything wrong. He didn't deserve to be attacked. He could take all of Adian's stuff out of his pack right now, and it would make his life way easier. His pack was already kind of heavy, and he hadn't even loaded any of the militia's stuff yet. Maybe he really should just take the stuff out. It wasn't like Adian was very grateful for his help. His thoughts raced by at first, but they began to slow along with his breathing and heart rate. As his thoughts slowed, his defenses were lowered and he began to think more rationally, less emotionally. Maybe Adian wasn't actually mad at him. Maybe he was just lashing out in anger because he had gotten so worked up in his conversation with the captain. It can't be easy to leave your life behind to escape someone only to feel morally obligated to put yourself under that person's power again. As Dre put himself into Adian's shoes, he started to get frustrated about the situation for Adian instead of himself. "I'm sorry," Adian spoke aloud and broke the calm silence. The words startled Dre out of his thoughts. He looked around and noticed as a few men who were in the process of fixing a tent nearby gave him and Adian funny looks. He then brought his attention back to Adian, who was looking down at his feet with a solemn expression on his face. Dre was about to reply, but Adian continued speaking. "I shouldn't have lost my temper with you or started accusing you. You don't deserve that. I know that you're still figuring out your class. Heck, it's the first day and you have one of the strangest skills I have ever seen. I wouldn't be surprised if you're still figuring things out about your pack months from now. There's no excuse for my actions. I should be better than that." He shook his head. "No, I am better than that, and I hope you can forgive me." He stood there, awkwardly, for a moment, but then quickly turned and walked in the direction of Neridni. What had just happened? Dre couldn't remember the last time a fight had been de-escalated so quickly. In fact, he didn't think he had ever had such a time to remember. He stood there, confused, for longer than was reasonable before he shook his head and started to walk in the direction of the large tent in the center of the clearing. His thoughts were still lingering on the conversation when he entered Captain Rucker's tent. It was a large, ornate thing, and to Dre's inexperienced eyes, seemed overly furnished for a temporary militia camp. There were ornate rugs, heavy-looking chests, and even a couple large barrels, which Dre suspected contained some sort of expensive alcohol. There was so much stuff that the large wagon, which had been dragged along behind the militia by a couple common laborers when they had arrived the day before, must have only contained the tent's contents. The captain turned away from a map pinned to the canvas side of the tent and immediately started questioning Dre on his class in general, but quickly his curiosity honed in on the pack itself. So once again, Dre found himself doing his best to explain the extent of a skill that he barely understood himself. He almost got stabbed when he forgot to tell Rucker that he was the only one capable of retrieving items until after having already placed many of the captain's personal things into his pack. Rucker was only appeased after Dre told him that if he was killed, all the items within the pack would be disgorged from it before the pack dissolved into nothingness. Dre had absolutely no reason to think that was true. He had come up with it in a panic while staring at the point of the captain's sword. The more he thought about it, though, the more he concluded that it had been a prudent tale to tell Rucker, since it provided an easy way for the captain to get all of his stuff back if Dre ever decided to be uncooperative, while it also did not incentivize the captain to kill him or to have someone else kill him just to get the pack itself. Dre was only now starting to realize that his pack would be heavily coveted by all, especially if people thought that they could take it for themselves. He had never seen anything like it, and he'd only heard about equipment so useful in heroic tales. Unless Dre was carrying his weight in enchanted jewels, he doubted the things within his pack would ever be as valuable as the pack itself. Now, if he were in a tavern and someone shady asked him about his pack's capabilities, then he would definitely change his tune. It would probably be best to tell such people that if he died, his pack would disappear with all the items inside it. No reason to make himself even a bigger target for robbery than he already was. After the seemingly countless number of items the captain had given him were placed into his pack, Dre could feel the straps digging into the meat of his shoulders. But it was manageable. It had to be. So Dre kept his complaints internal as he was sent with a guide, or more likely a guard, to introduce him to militia members that might have gear for him to carry, which unfortunately ended up being almost every member present. He didn't have the energy to remember the 20 or so faces, let alone the names, as he traveled from person to person and his pack grew heavier and heavier. His only interaction was to grunt in greeting, and grunt as more weight was added to his shoulders. While moving between members, he kept repeating a marching chant that synced with the rhythm of his steps. Bear the load. Bear the load. Bear the load. By the time Dre was fully loaded, each step was a struggle. But it was still something that he could manage. It had to be. He hadn't said no to a single item and wouldn't stop moving forward until the mission was finished. His guard pointed out the direction of Adian and didn't bother following as Dre trudged towards the field musician. It must have been quite evident to the man that Dre wasn't going to be able to make any sort of quick escape. After all, Dre was forced to watch the ground in front of his feet and focus on each step to keep moving forward without losing his balance. The weight reduction capabilities of the bag were the only thing making what he was doing even possible. But it wasn't easing the fire burning inside of his legs or reducing the stabbing pain in his shoulders. Those would just go away if he pushed through, though, right? Probably. Maybe. It had to be somewhere within the realm of possibility. Dre almost bumped into Adian before he came to a grateful stop. He was breathing heavily, and sweat dripped generously from his brow. He looked up at Adian, hoping to see approval in the man's gaze. Instead, Adian had a single eyebrow raised, and the corner of his mouth flickered up and down, switching the man's expression between smirk and frown. A significant amount of Adian's shouting, and militiamen grumbling later, the last member, a short, stocky fellow with flame-red hair, was walking away with the vast majority of the stuff he had given to Dre slung over his shoulder and a rueful grin on his face. Adian had forced everyone who had overburdened Dre to come and take their stuff back. Dre's pack was a far cry from being light, but he no longer felt as though he was carrying the entirety of Neridany on his back. Dre had taken off the pack while he had returned items to their owners. Without the burden on his shoulders, he was able to properly appreciate the respect that Adian received from all the members of the militia. Adian knew most of them by name, and the deference shown to him by those he didn't know signified that they knew about him. It made Dre wonder what Adian had done to so thoroughly earn their respect, that it held firm even after he had abandoned them. Before Dre could speculate any further, Captain Rucker emerged from his tent, and with a few harsh words of encouragement provoked the camp into motion. In a much shorter time than Dre's already tired body had hoped for, the group was on the march. Dre noticed, with a mixture of pride and resentment, that no one else was heavily burdened. He desperately tried not to notice that the captain carried nothing but the expensive yet raggedy clothes on his back and the sword at his hip. The pace was quick, but not frantic as they headed west into Neridni. Even still, it took all that Dre had to keep from falling behind. At first, he tried to stay abreast with Adian. The field musician wandered along the line as he marched, to the obvious but unspoken displeasure of Rucker. He struck up conversations with many, but he tended to linger closest to a group of 4, whose names Dre couldn't, for the life of him, remember. Before long, though, Dre was unable to stay abreast with the empty-shouldered man. His legs were once again burning, and sweat was streaming down his face. His new goal was to stay close enough to at least hear Adian's conversations, a goal that he mostly succeeded at. Yet, even though he was close enough to hear the words, the meaning behind them seemed to leak out with his sweat. After what felt like an age, they arrived at the edge of Neridni. To Dre's great dismay, the heavily armed procession continued through the town without stopping. Many townsfolk stopped what they were doing and wandered outside to watch the spectacle. Even as unimpressive as a group of 20 or so dirty and sweaty people doing nothing more than what amounted to a fast walk was sure to be, but Dre understood. He had been one of the gawking townsfolk more times than he had the energy to remember. In a rare moment where Dre braved a glance away from the ground directly in front of his feet, he caught the blue-eyed gaze of Asya and saw a concerned, hurt look on her face. He was too focused on the arduous task of putting one foot in front of the other to give it much thought in the moment, though, and they were well west of the town before the ramifications of what he had seen fully occurred to him. Asya would have absolutely no idea why Dre was traveling with the militia. He hadn't ever actually told her about his class before he had directed his self-derived anger towards her in an attempt to chase her away. Dre guiltily realized that with the excitement of finding out about his class and the prospect of going with Adian in the militia, he hadn't thought about Asya once, which was simply unacceptable. Asya had always been there for him. She was his only true friend. She had been willing to stay his friend and potentially become even more than friends, even if he ended up being nothing more than a common laborer. She should have been the first person that he told. Dre knew himself well enough to know that he had subconsciously been avoiding thinking of her in a cowardly attempt to avoid taking responsibility for how monstrous he had been to her the day before. He had responded to her concern with nothing short of evil, especially from her perspective, and now she saw him leaving with the militia with no explanation. What thoughts of betrayal must be running through her head? A large part of Dre wanted to turn around, run back to Neridni, find Asya, and tell her everything. But it was too late. The captain wouldn't delay the mission for such a silly reason, and there was no way that he would let Dre march off with all the militia's supplies. All Dre could do now was fulfill his duty and impress Adian. Hopefully, when he was able to tell her everything, that everything would include that he was a member of an adventuring team. Dre had one final thought, before his coherency was once again lost to the struggle of the march. Surely, hearing that he was becoming an adventurer would fill Asya with excitement. She would all but forget about their fight.